Thank you, Diolch Siarna. Mae'n bleser I bod ma heddiw. Thank you also to all of you for joining us here today as we look back, as you heard, on the journey so far, but also cast our minds forward to where we will go next in terms of our implementation of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. Now, as a Cardiff girl, with some commiserations to my friends and colleagues from the West, I'm particularly pleased to be here in the home of Wales's newest Premier League football club. No one knows better, I think, than the players and staff at the football club here today that delivering ambitious goals takes time. Achieving success requires dedication, investment and support. And of course, some critics doubted their progress and questioned direction, but loyal supporters knew that the journey would take risks, diversions and perseverance. And it's a similar journey, I think, that public bodies face in terms of implementing the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And of course, your success will not, unfortunately, allow you to play in the Premier League or indeed earn the same amount of money as some of those players. But it will, of course, contribute to creating a better Wales for future generations, which I think is far more important. I'd also like to say a huge thanks to Hugh and his team at the Wales Audit Office for all the work that they put into this event and for working so closely with my team on the production of our parallel reports. Now, at the last conference that we held jointly around 18 months ago, we joked about our dual approach being a bit like the Who and the How. And I hope that you found our approach to publishing these reports in parallel useful in providing you feedback on what we've both seen so far and on what we expect to see next. We've worked very closely together over the last 2 years and are planning further on how we will align our monitoring work going forward. And our two reports have aimed to provide an overview of the purpose, progress and pace of where Wales is in terms of us collectively implementing this groundbreaking piece of legislation. And from my perspective, a key theme from the report that I have is that we need to be broadening our thinking beyond the who and the how, actually to the what. And that means we need to be looking at whether we're actually being specific enough, whether we're clear enough in terms of what success looks like when we achieve it, and whether we're sure that the collection of what we're doing are adding up to making sure we're meeting that statutory duty to maximise our contribution to all of the wellbeing goals. And as Hugh spoke previously, I made a note of some key words that stood out to me: listening, perceive, talking, and an emphasis on what we're being told. And as Hugh rightly said, we're hearing great things. The perception of the Act is largely positive. From all of our listening, people are talking the right talk and things sound great. But there is a word that's lacking there, and that's the doing. And that's where I echo Hugh's analysis that the action now needs to match the level of enthusiasm that we're seeing around the Act, and that public bodies must become more ambitious and adventurous and provide better clarity on how they're meeting their obligations under the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. Last week, I spoke at the launch of the Ceredigion Wellbeing Plan and suggested that maybe we could organise a theme tune to play at the beginning of every PSB meeting from now on to get us geared up and kind of in the mindset of what we needed to do at that meeting. And for me, that theme tune would be that Elvis classic, a little less conversation, a little more action, please. So feel free to envisage yourselves strutting into your PSB to that. It seemed that I started something there as subsequent speakers throughout the day felt compelled to build on an Elvis song into everything that each presentation that they gave. So feel free also to rise to that challenge in your discussions throughout the day. Now, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act is not just about thinking differently, it's about working differently. It's about accepting that business as usual is no longer sustainable and it's not fit for the future of public services that we want here in Wales. As Hugh rightly identified, there are a number of you out there who can see this act as a catalyst for change, to give you the permission and the confidence to work differently. For others, it may still be seen as a legal obligation and an extra level of compliance. And again, if that's the case, then we are, of course, more likely to be paying closer attention to the decisions that you're making. And when I think of the title of the report, The Journey So Far, it may seem slightly cliched to use such a well-known metaphor, but we believe it captures the reality of where we are with this relatively new piece of legislation. And perhaps if we're being really honest, we'd call it more of an expedition than a journey, because we haven't been here before, we don't quite know what will hit us along the way. And an expedition requires determination, it requires training over a long period of time, it requires the right equipment. Some of you will say it requires funding too. I'm sympathetic to that, but more in terms of funding to make the change than funding for the outcomes themselves, as this is not about doing new things outside of the system we're currently in, it's about changing the system from the inside out. And of course, there are some who perhaps expect that the destination should be reached more quickly. That instead of it being a long expedition, we should be able to hop into Elon Musk's still in development Hyperloop system and get from A to B as fast as the speed of sound. But to do that, of course, there needs to be investment in innovation, support for development, removal of barriers which impede change, and a willingness to take risks throughout the system. And that requires decision makers at all levels, from government right down, to embrace those concepts. And let me be clear about the need for change throughout the system and in every organisation within the system, starting with, I believe, those who currently hold the biggest share of the resources. I've been pleased to see some really great examples of projects and programmes shifting in line with the Future Generations Act within the health service, and I recognise that moving to the new whilst meeting the demands of the old is challenging, but if you have almost 50% of the resources, there is an expectation that you will be doing your fair share of the heavy lifting in making the change that applies from a strategic level in government down to each of your organisations. And I will be monitoring particularly closely how this change is happening. But overall, I'm encouraged that most of us are at least setting off on this journey or expedition. I believe this journey starts at the place of making simple changes, moves through various stages of challenging current practice, stretching ourselves and working with others in developing new approaches, and then enters a stage of transformation that changes people's lives. And the final destination is where Wales, here in Wales, we can be sure that our policy making and service delivery is in the best possible health in terms of delivering for current and future generations, both people and the planet. And so on that expedition or journey, where are we now? It's a year since the public sector in Wales published the wellbeing objectives on how they will improve the social, economic, environmental and cultural wellbeing of Wales. And in fact, since April, the councils, health boards, national parks, fire and rescue services, Welsh Government and all of the other national organisations represented in this room have been working towards a collective 345 objectives, just short of one for every day of the year. Now, as you'll know, the public service boards are also in the process of publishing their joint objectives focused on improving the wellbeing of people in their local area. And since the Act was passed, we've done a lot of talking here in Wales about how this legislation is groundbreaking, and the level of international interest has only sought to bolster our own trumpet blowing. But in reality, it is this, in the setting of the wellbeing objectives and how public bodies are taking steps to meet them, that we are walking the talk, showing, not telling the world, how we in Wales are doing sustainable development right. And so in this report I published last week, it's reflective, it gives a bird's eye view of all of the things that my office have come across in terms of how you're implementing the Act across Wales. And as public bodies prepare their annual reports over the next year, my report provides a snapshot of what we've witnessed so far. I hope you will have taken the time, or will take the time, to read both mine and the Auditor General's report, as they provide a wealth of information and reflection for you to take forward. And it is, of course, important to recognise and celebrate some of the successes so far. There are some great examples out there, many of which feature in our reports, of that innovative thinking and change in the approach and the way of doing things. There's the examples of Betsy Cadwallader Health Board in North Wales, who are engaging in a range of different projects and having a big focus on social prescribing. There's the approach that the Welsh Government have taken to revise the transport appraisal guidance, which my office have worked closely with them to support, which offers new guidance to local authorities on new transport projects and how, in meeting our obligations in transport, we can be meeting the obligations under the Act. There's Bridgend, who are taking an approach to piloting early action and help to tackle adverse childhood experiences. There's Caerphilly Council, who have acted on their objective around reducing the authority's carbon footprint and have allocated funding for solar panelling on 20 schools, as well as an additional 3 solar schemes on corporate buildings. This alone is generating approximately 56 tonnes of carbon savings every year. And we know that the council are close to getting electric pool vehicles and are working hard on the installation of LED lighting across their estates. There's Swansea Council, who aren't just building council homes, they're building council homes to passive house standards. And these are just a handful of the examples we're told about. Some may seem small in scale, but we're realistic that large-scale transformation isn't going to happen overnight. And we're constantly told that the officers and people working within the public sector are crying out for more guidance and help on where to start with some of this. And that's where I see part of my role as Commissioner, bringing people together to highlight good practice and to act as a connector when it comes to sharing what's working. That's why I've launched a programme of work within my office, which if you haven't heard about yet, you will do soon, called Art of the Possible. It's a programme that is truly working in partnership, and I want to thank those organisations who are working with me and sharing resources on this and on other programmes, including the Arts Council, Sport Wales, Mid and West Fire and Rescue, South Wales Police, the Wildlife Trust, the Wales Co-op Centre, United Welsh Housing Association, Public Health Wales, and even the private sector. BT have seconded someone in to take forward this work. And the purpose is to look at what's possible when it comes to the 7 wellbeing goals, to provide some answers to the questions of what if. What if we did things differently? What if we started any project with thinking through the lens of what we could achieve and what was possible in terms of making a contribution to each of the goals? And the work that will be coming from this will be shared as we work through the programme with public bodies. Now, of course, as Commissioner, I recognise that contributing to the challenge of long-term culture change, there are a myriad of existing policies, guidance, budget allocations and performance indicators which do not embed the new requirements of the Act. And that is where I see part of my role as recognising and helping to remove some of the barriers that get in the way of changing the system towards a system that we need to see. The parliamentary review in health and social care, for example, calls for a change from within and is an opportunity to recast performance indicators, workforce planning and budget allocations. I've recently written to the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Care to propose that any new funding that goes into that transformation fund to meet the parliamentary review should be spent on preventative work and should be spent in partnership with other public bodies. Because if the conditions of other legislation, policies and processes do not enable a culture change, the right decisions cannot be made under the Act and it becomes another legislative burden or competing priority for public bodies, and we cannot allow that to happen. So when we come to look at the wellbeing objectives you have all set, what are they telling us? So I appreciate that public bodies have spent a lot of time and energy in meeting the challenging timescales for publishing their objectives, wellbeing assessments and developing wellbeing plans. But in general, many have published statements that may well make sense to them but are not particularly clear to those reading from the outside to understand. It's also clear to me that many of the wellbeing objectives largely resemble corporate objectives that would have been set prior to 2017. It's not enough to simply reference the Act. You must clearly be demonstrating how you have considered all of the 7 wellbeing goals and how you have set your objectives in accordance with the 5 ways of working. As an office, we undertook some detailed analysis of all 345 odd of the wellbeing objectives, looking for common themes. And whilst there's no exact science to this, it provided a useful insight into how public bodies intend to improve economic, environmental, social and cultural wellbeing. For example, 99 objectives set by 38 public bodies relate to health and social care and social prescribing and safeguarding. 74 objectives relate to community cohesion, safety and access to services. 59 relate to the environment, natural resources, resilience and climate change. 38 relate to culture, heritage, Welsh language, tourism and arts. But for me, the question is so what? And indeed, that will be the question that everyone else out there is asking too. The objectives themselves amount to very little without targeted, detailed steps in order to meet them. Saying you plan to give every child the best start in life is not enough. How are you planning to do that? How are you going to work differently in order to deliver that objective? And ensuring that we're not just doing the easy things, but looking to reform the whole system is also important. Many of you have set objectives to tackle the root causes of adverse childhood experiences, an issue which is particularly close to my heart. Some of the steps you propose focus on creating an ACE-informed workforce. That's good, but it's just part of the picture, because we also need to ensure that the system that this workforce is operating within is actually working correctly, so that it's geared up to respond to the ACEs when they're identified. How also are we going to look through a new lens in terms of how we do things to make sure that we're meeting our contribution to all of the wellbeing goals? Whilst I don't think that an approach of setting one objective for each of the goals is right, what we do want to see is how, when you've considered the things that you will do to meet your objectives, you've thought about the ways of doing things differently and ways of maximising your contribution to all of the goals. So many of you, for example, have set objectives relating to skills. Most have tended to focus on meeting the demand for business in the future. That, of course, is understandable, but we need to see how you're considering all of the goals in this. How, for example, are you looking to the long term in planning your apprenticeships programmes? Are we funding apprenticeships in jobs which may not exist due to automation? Have we even considered what jobs there are likely to be in the future? Are we thinking about the new skills that we will need in order to meet our obligations around decarbonisation? I haven't yet come across an apprenticeship in renewable energy technology or electric vehicle mechanics. How are we thinking about the skills that enable us to lead a good life, not just get a good job? So what value do we place on skills obtained through volunteering or through participation in sport and physical activity? How are we considering the importance of softer skills when we consider the future trends around health and social care and working with an ageing population? What I'm saying is that we need to think bigger and we need to think broader. It's clear to me that a number of public bodies have stuck to their core business and have not yet considered how they can maximise their contribution. But I want to advise you to see the Act as useful. I've spoken multiple times about the Act not becoming a compliance-based exercise, but a vehicle to challenge the way in which decisions are made, as a prompt to a question of what if? What if we did things differently? What if, when it came to social housing, we focused on low-cost housing for students and looked at combined arrangements which included increased volunteering with older people? There are models like that in other parts of the world. In some of our rural communities, that might help to keep some of our younger people in rural communities through low-cost housing and would encourage intergenerational relationships and sharing of skills. What if we look to develop apprenticeships in engineering for renewables, to develop community energy schemes and ensure that all of our public bodies are powered by renewable energies which are fitted by those apprentices? What if we managed our uplands and our agriculture differently to create jobs for the future, prevent flooding, placing green infrastructure requirements on all future developments and infrastructure plans? What if we banned plastic cups and procured local social enterprises to provide cups and plates, requiring them to work with people with learning disabilities or the long-term unemployed, thereby developing a community enterprise hub that was powered by renewables, developed by the apprenticeships and staffed by people who would have otherwise been unemployed? What if every public sector organisation gave time off for volunteering for well-being, for their own personal well-being as well as community well-being, walking groups, allotments, reading with kids in schools? What if those allotments provided food for local families? What if GPs were instead referring to these projects as a first port of call instead of issuing prescriptions which rack up our annual NHS bills? We don't have to resign ourselves to a vision of the future reflective of our current reality. It is now not a luxury but a responsibility to question and go beyond business as usual. And within my office, we recognise that we need to support organisations as part of this continued journey. We recognise that we do not have the monopoly on wisdom, but we do have a bird's eye view of what's going on across Wales, and we see our role in connecting the dots, facilitating discussions and sharing good practice where we can. I do encourage honesty, and I've been encouraged by those public bodies who are willing to reflect on where things might not be working, and where they're willing to engage in new conversations with new people about how they can improve. I think in the past we've had a tendency to keep the discussions within our public sector club and within our comfort zone, occasionally paying lip service to involvement through consultation or having a sector representative on a working group. External organisations often express frustration about how our organisations are operating, and I think that this is largely because we haven't provided opportunities to bring them in to work through with us on the issues from the start, to understand the challenges that we have within our organisations, the boundaries we're operating within, and our own internal difficulties of shifting culture, and therefore conflict and frustration can arise. So of course nobody wants to wash their dirty linen in public, but I think there's something about exposing our creased t-shirts and getting a bigger group of people to help with the ironing, and I can tell you as a parent of 5 that is certainly very welcome. We also recognise how hard the task ahead of you is, and that's why I've set out 9 expectations within the report for you to consider when publishing your annual reports over the next year. These include: public bodies must clearly set out their wellbeing objectives and what steps they are taking to meet them. They must include how the 5 ways of working and 7 wellbeing goals have been used to inform the setting of objectives and the steps you will take. But this does not exhaust the duty of public bodies. The Act clearly makes setting objectives as steps as a means, but only one means of discharging the sustainable development duty. How does the organisation intend to maximise its contribution to the 7 goals and reference the 7 core areas of change as you're required to do in the statutory guidance? Public bodies must also provide information on how resources have been used to take the steps to meet your wellbeing objectives. Annual reports must also describe how your organisation is making sense of its duty to use the Sustainable Development Principle, as well as articulating how this fits with other legislative duties, along with corporate objectives and operational services. It is also essential that public bodies are looking forward with the ambition of where they would like to be in 5, 10, 15, 25 years' time. Long term doesn't just mean the next 12 months. When it comes to tracking your progress, you must explain in your annual reports how far you have taken steps to meet your objectives, how effective these steps have been, how you are tracking progress, and how you're adopting or adapting new ways of demonstrating progress. And it's also essential that your annual reports provide evidence of how you're being held accountable by the public and through your scrutiny functions in everything you do. It's also critical that you're revisiting your wellbeing objectives and consider how fit for purpose they are a year on. If objectives are being reviewed or changed, this of course must be explained in the context of the 5 ways of working and the 7 goals. And finally, your reports must be clear. This includes simple things, dating documents, keeping information simple, helping people to get involved in compiling, writing and presenting of your reports. These aren't some top secret documents written by a handful of people. They must be transparent. They must tell the population of Wales the story of where you are as an organisation and how you've involved the people that you serve. And of course, for all this to happen, bold and ambitious leadership, which encourages innovation and allows you the space to fail, is vital. I'm pleased now to welcome Sian Morgan, the Permanent Secretary of the Welsh Government. Sian is someone who I believe is committed to making the changes necessary for this Act to work. She's someone who's focused on changing the culture within her own organisation, recognising that the Welsh Government must set the tone for making change happen, but also being honest about where they are in doing that and the challenges that they face. And I'd like to end by thanking Hugh as well for the work that he's done to create the right culture for the Act to work. Now, there may not be many of you who could say you were thrilled to be working with auditors, but I've been incredibly pleased with the close working relationship that our organisations have developed and the pragmatism as well as constructive challenge that Hugh and his team are bringing to embedding the Act, as well as going on a journey themselves, just as my team are, to walk the talk of the Act. Hugh said that this is about the future, our future generations, our children, grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren to come. It's poignant that as we're looking forward, we say goodbye to someone who's done so much on getting us where we are today. So Hugh, thank you for everything you've done Thank you for listening, and I look forward to speaking with many of you over the course of the day. Thank you a diolch yn fawr.